An old film records the historic arrival of the first jumbo jet at London's Heathrow Airport in 1970. Pan American Airways Clipper Victor 747. 7 years later, this very plane would lie in ruins, shattered in the world's worst air crash. 583 people died because a pilot was in a hurry. High above the beaches, literally up in the clouds, is Tenerife's Los Rodeos Airport, now rarely used since it became the most notorious airport in the world. 1,000 people have lost their lives here in airline accidents. The reason? Los Rodeos is shrouded in clouds on most days. Sunday, March 27th, 1977, was just such a day. Flying to the Canaries were two jumbo jets, Boeing 747s, both charter flights. One was a Pan American plane full of tourists, the other a Dutch jet from KLM Airlines. One of the many strange things about that day was that neither pilot had set out for Tenerife.
We were starting our descent for the approach and landing at Las Palmas, our original destination. And as we were doing that, we got a call from air traffic control to divert immediately to Tenerife.
When a terrorist bomb exploded on the next island, this small airport suddenly became choked with planes. The co-pilot on the PanAm Jumbo was Bob Bragg. It's the first time he's been back to Los Rodeos since that Sunday in 1977. 20 years later, bits of his plane still lie all around.
When we landed here, the entire ramp was completely and totally congested. There were probably 20 to 30 airplanes that had also diverted and were parked here, which necessitated us having to go way down to the end here and park.
By now, there are 400 people who've been up all night, half the day before possibly, and they don't quite understand what's going on. And our information was certainly limited at that point. We really didn't know the circumstances or what had actually transpired. The facilities on board, I suppose by now, were a little, well, it was busy, let me put it that way, and everybody was restless.
The Dutch pilot, Captain Van Zanten, was getting restless too. His plane was parked alongside the Pan Am, and the American pilots could hear him constantly on the radio, anxious to be on his way before he ran out of flying hours.
He was very irritated about the situation, as I'm sure all of us were, because most of us had been flying all night long, and we were all anxious to get to our destination. Basically, about that time, he decided to start refueling. Concurrent with that, they opened up the airport at Las Palmas. So the engineer and I got out and walked and measured the wingtip clearance between the KLM 747 and our 747. And we found out that we were about 12 feet short of being able to get around him and taxi out. So we had to wait for the KLM airplane to refuel.
The two aircraft were parked at the wrong end of the runway for takeoff. With so many planes choking the airport, the only way to get to the correct end was by taxiing up the runway itself. Drawing on the investigators' report, this simulation recreates the accident. Air traffic control ordered the KLM to go first and wait when it got to the far end. The Pan Am would follow, but would turn off the runway about 3/4 of the way down to let the KLM take off.
By the time we got the clearance that we were going to leave and take off, people were very happy by then. They were quite elated. These were people who were going to meet a cruise ship in the Canary Islands and cruise around the Mediterranean. And a lot of them were senior citizens that had come from California.
As the Pan Am entered the runway, clouds began to roll down from the surrounding hills. The American pilots soon found themselves inching through the dense mist, looking for their turnoff. By now, the KLM pilot had already reached the far end, turned, and was anxious to be on his way.
The tower called us and asked were we off the runway, and I said negative, we're still on the runway, but we will report clear of the runway. We looked up and we saw the KLM airplane's lights, and I immediately saw the lights shaking, and I said, I think he's moving. And then it was very obvious that he was moving. So I started yelling, get off, get off. And the captain turned the airplane, went to full power on the throttles. As we were turning, I looked back out of the right window and couldn't believe it, that he was doing what he was doing. And I'll never forget, I saw the rotating beacon underneath the belly of the airplane. I closed my eyes and ducked. And I didn't even think he'd done us any damage. It was very little noise, very little shaking or anything.
I was just very, very aware of things in slow motion, and everything was flying around, and all of a sudden everything settled, and nothing looked like it had before. I didn't see anything I recognized. There were no people around.
When I looked up, it was obvious that he had done us a lot of damage. The windows were completely gone. I looked back to the right wing was on fire. I looked back to the left, and the entire upper deck lounge was gone. We had 28 people up there, and there was nothing left. It looked like someone had taken a big knife and just sliced the entire top of the airplane off. I could see all the way to the tail of the airplane. So I reached down to try to shut off the engines with the start levers, which controls the fuel to the engines. That didn't do any good. Obviously, all the controls were severed. Then I reached up to get the fire control handles, which is up top, which shuts the engines down. And that's when I discovered that the top of the cockpit was gone. I looked around, there was no side of the cockpit left, so I stood up and elected to jump over the side, which was about 48 feet.
Dorothy Kelly found herself in the cargo hold, but managed to climb to the top of the blazing plane.
I looked over the side, and it was like looking out of the second floor window from my house with nothing but jagged metal, and my thought was, by now I had lost my shoes. I've survived this, and I'm going to kill myself jumping out of here on all that debris down there.
When Dorothy Kelly jumped from the blazing plane, she broke an arm, fractured her skull, and became a heroine by rescuing the captain and tending the passengers. People
were lying all over the field, hurt, certainly bloody, very, very badly injured. One thing I remember in particular, there was a man who had his clothes almost completely blown off him. He was just wandering around in a daze, and I remember I kept trying to push him off to the side and get him away, and he would just keep coming right back into all the action. People were just banging in at the windows and shouting. I mean, you could hear shouts, screams from inside. And that was probably my most vivid memory, and what has hurt the most through all those years is remembering all those people and hearing them scream and realizing that they were being burned, and they were not going to get out because there was no way we could get to them.
Tenerife remains the world's worst air disaster. 583 people died. Everyone aboard the KLM plane, which burned up on the runway, and all but 77 of the PanAm passengers. Paul Roysch, one of PanAm's senior captains, helped investigate the crash. Among the records are the charred instruments from the PanAm jumbo jet. The day after the disaster, Roysch arrived in Tenerife with other American investigators. Their first job was to listen to radio messages between the air traffic control tower and the two planes. Right away, Roysch heard something that grabbed his attention.
There was a point at which you could not tell what the KLM first officer was saying, and we asked that that be played over several times. It was obvious that the man was under stress. His voice changed its timbre. It became tremulous. It was slightly shaky, and his words were blurted out rather than spoken clearly. And that was a benchmark. That caught our attention right away. I believe that the first officer's voice changed because he saw something happening in the cockpit that shouldn't be happening.
A cockpit voice recorder from the KLM plane furnished the next clue to the mystery. As the KLM plane reached the end of the runway and turned, Captain Van Zanten immediately pushed up the throttles to take off.
First officer said, "No, wait a minute, we don't have our air traffic control clearance." The captain said, "Yes, I know that." He pulled the throttles back. "Now go ahead and call for it."
The tower gave Captain Van Zanten his air traffic control clearance, which tells him only what route to follow. To actually take off, Van Zanten had to ask permission, but he never got that far.
As the first officer was reading the clearance back to the controllers, the captain again commenced the takeoff. He pushed the throttles up. He said, "We go." The aircraft started to roll. The first officer sensed that this was not right. He knew that they hadn't been cleared for takeoff, and so he blurted out, "And we are taken off, or we are at takeoff." It wasn't even that clear. The words are difficult to comprehend, and the tenor of the voice changes. It's obviously very tense. But he felt that he had done his part in letting people know that they were commencing their takeoff. All this time, the Dutch airplane was accelerating down the runway. The flight engineer in the Dutch cockpit heard the words from the PanAm airplane saying, "Roger will advise when we're clear," and he questioned the captain and the first officer. He said, "Then is he not clear then?" The Pan American, and both crew members said, yeah, he's clear." At that point, they were just entering the heavy cloud. They saw the Pan Am aircraft desperately trying to get off the runway, but it was not in time. The rest is history.
Here, this one. Here. Computer. Where is that located?
Let's take it. Yeah, let me take a look.
I just want to know where it's located to get a feel. Just to see if it's close.
Under international regulations, the investigation was conducted by the Spanish, but both the Americans and the Dutch were allowed to take part.
That's the cell card.
The investigators soon reached different conclusions.
That is in that area as well. That's right. That and the fuel flow check.
The Dutch were, in my opinion, searching for something to fasten onto that would divert the blame from their own countrymen. Mainly, I believe they tried to pin the blame on the air traffic controllers. To some extent, they tried to pin the blame on the Pan Am crew.
The stakes were high, not only for KLM, but for their most famous captain, Jacob Van Zanten, the very pilot whose face stared out of the KLM ads.
Captain Van Zanten was a pilot of great prestige in KLM. He was a top instructor pilot. In fact, he was so well regarded in KLM that it's my understanding when the Dutch officials, or the KLM officials, first heard about this accident, they tried to find Van Zanten to ask him to come down and be part of the investigation team. Unfortunately, of course, he wasn't available.
The Spanish investigators ruled the accident was caused by the Dutch captain taking off without clearance, a basic error caused by his anxiety to get on his way. But a Dutch board of inquiry absolved Van Zanten and placed blame on a simple misunderstanding with air traffic control. The pilot thought he had his clearance. Paul Reusch blames the turbulent personality of Captain Van Zanten.
He was a difficult man to contradict, especially for a junior pilot such as the first officer on this flight. He did have the courage to stop him once when the captain first started the throttles up, but I don't think he felt he could get away with it again.